WhiskyJason, yeah, Whisky Live, Dublin 2024, together with
Fionnán O'Connor.
So you're an icon in the Irish whiskey scene.
Only among the heathen icons, yes.
Okay,
you know,
the geeks.
I'm on a totem pole somewhere, praying to myself.
Yeah, praying. Well, that's how you imagine
Yeah.
That's very good. So well, how do I know you? What was your first book that really put Irish whiskey on the map?
I don't think I've written such a book, but I wrote a book.
Which one
A Glass Apart, yes.
For me, it was my wow moment for Irish whiskey, all right? So
well, thank you.
I have a little bit, never meet your idols, your stars, and I get to meet you here. That's great. So you're working on a new book as well, aren't you?
I am.
All right, so if I hold
Créatúr.
this up here, what is this?
Créatúr.
It's crowdsourced. Tell us more.
It is. So the first book, A Glass Apart, it was about 10 years ago, came out in 2015.
Yep.
A lot has happened since,
Yes.
so I wrote it, ended up...
2015,
Yeah,
oh, wow, 9 years ago, yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
God be with them times, you know,
Yeah.
the Irish whiskey in the rare old times. It's changed a lot.
Yes.
And actually we launched The Glass Apart at Whisky Live, when Whisky Live Dublin was much smaller than it is now. But and we'll probably launch this one here when it comes
year, I
out.
hope, maybe.
The 2026 is when we're looking, yeah.
Okay, 2026, all right,
So,
very good.
In the interim, I ended up writing a PhD on the history of Irish
We'll talk
whiskey.
about that
Oh, it's
in a
probably
moment.
easier to talk about that first
go
than
there
to talk.
first. Right,
Yeah,
let's talk about the
because that came before Créatúr.
Let's go for that, all right.
So, the PhD was on the history of Irish whiskey material spirit,
Yes.
or mash bills in trade terms, but the academic term was material spirit, because
Okay.
materiality is their entry into that concept of what is it made from. And so I was tracking basically a lot of the history, and a lot of it came out of The Glass Apart, where I kind of found a number of things that I wanted to look deeper into, and
Like reality, but yet history, and it didn't always sync.
and so you hear all these industry tales, and they kind of collapse when you push them. Like you hear, Irish pasta was invented by the malt tax, or this, and these kind of just so stories, and then you look, and you're like, this isn't actually true. And it's like mixed mash, raw barley, and Irish whiskey like 100 years before the malt tax happened. None of this stuff, and I come from a history background originally, and so I was thinking, geez, there's a lot here that I'd like to keep exploring, and I managed to get some academic funding to do a PhD on this material history. Spent about 4 years going through archives looking for old recipes, day books, anything I could find, lawsuits, whatever.
Exactly. So remember, this is time before we had the internet where we just couldn't Google something, all right?
Yes.
You have to have physical papers and actually touch them and get permissions to go into the archives and into the libraries and so on. It's work.
Yeah.
It's real work.
Drudgery. Yeah. But anyway, eventually got this distillery here, Bourbon, to produce a series of 10 historic mash bills, all the exact same circumstances, same fermentation, same yeast, same fermentation times, cut points, distillation regimens, separated faints so they didn't contaminate each other. Everything.
You took over the distillery for a week, or was it 10 days?
A month and a half.
A month. Sorry, excuse me. All right. It was a month and a half. You took over the distillery.
Yeah, because we had to do and there was a lot of stuff. So, for instance, to make sure that the recycled faints didn't come from a different mash bill, we had to do everything twice and separate them, and so everything was done to an academic rigor, which meant taking up a lot of their time. And they were good sports about it and said, all right, if we're going to do this, we'll do it properly.
We're going to be part of Irish history. Let's do it right. So what are the 10 mash bills?
So
I think, right?
There's a smattering of them on the table.
Yes.
So here's this one is from the 1830s.
Yes.
This is from a book called, a fantastically titled book called A Philosophical and Statistical History of Inebriating Liquor.
And probably written originally in, was it Italian?
No.
English?
This is a book written in English by an Irish excise officer named Samuel Morewood.
Okay, good.
And he had and as an excise officer, he was obviously well aware of how the industry worked.
Yes.
He talks about the history of drink, but and it's actually one of the kind of old core books of the history of alcohol. The first time drink was treated, or not the first time, but one of comparatively rare times where someone decided to write a kind of a history of drink. So it's history of beer, history of this, but he happened to be an Irish excise officer, and there's a particularly lengthy bit about Irish distilling because obviously he knew a lot about it.
Right. That was the heyday of Irish whiskey as well. I mean, hey, and more Irish whiskey back then than Scotch.
Yes, and Samuel Moore would have been, again, excise officer in Dublin specifically, so right at the heart of it, you know. But this particular mash, and they're all single pot still, but not compliant with the modern definition. But they are the history of Irish pots to whiskey, you know, full stop. And certainly, and you know, I talked to Peter Mulrine a lot over at Blackwater. And
Peter, our crazy professor, I call him sometimes.
And
crazy scientist.
And he'd be familiar with this book as well, definitely. Samuel Moore would.
He's used some mash bills from it, I think, as well.
Well, from Samuel Moore would, absolutely. You know, and
back then, right?
And so you can see some of the, you know, the overlap. And you know, for me, these mash bills belong to the Irish people. They don't belong to any one distillery. So I'm glad to see the more doing it, the better. You know, and getting that blood into the system. But this particular one is interesting because Irish pot still used to have a lot of wheat in it for a very short period of time, and then basically during the Irish famine, the entire nature of Irish agriculture changed from one end to the other. A lot of the Irish landscape switched from tillage to pastoral and to sheep, basically. And wheat tillage collapsed. It was 8%. By 1860, wheat tillage was 8% of what it had been in 1830, you know, and it never recovers. So like Jameson and a lot of mashes had continued to have wheat, but in a very, very small, like Jameson had like 5% wheat in it into the 50s. But this is 30% wheat. So again, it's a much more, and I don't know if you're partaking or just...
I'm just going to smell.
Yeah, but they had that like Rolo caramel kind of smell.
Wow.
When it was new make, it had a kind of a bready, and it still does have that kind of carbohydrate, kind of baker's warmth, you know, comfort food whiskey.
Okay. Very good.
And so they were all basically, but that's an example where like the guts of the thesis was really about Irish agricultural history as much as, you know, because these mash bills, these recipes, yes, they taste different, but they are just as fascinatingly like the history of Irish tillage, the history of Irish agrarian experience. They're part of real people's lives, you know, and the change in wheat meant something much more severe to certain people than a little Rolo on the finish, you know, and I have to be respectful of that, obviously, you know, but there was that kind of spectrum. So then we put it, we did all these mash bills, then to make the point that it didn't belong to anyone, Boan sold the casts off. They all belong to like whiskey clubs, and Celtic Whiskey Shop own a bunch of them.
I own shares of them as well.
Yeah, they, you know, the two stars, JJ Corey, they're spread around. A lot of the societies, Belfast.
I own a share of a cask. All right,
they're all spread across. Anyway, we had a panel drawn up of 27 blenders and distillers, and we had everyone from Killowen to Middleton and in between, big and small. I'm amazed we got some of these people in the same room as each other, and they all volunteered their time and did this nosing panel. We took the Harriet Watt methodology and just they spent a day filling out forms. Then we ran it through GCMS, try and compare the kind of, you know, chemistry to the taste, and that, you know, and then provide that information back to the industry, and you know, and the thesis would be free. You know, I'm happy to, I don't want to bleed that for consultancy or papers or something.
PhD here.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll just start carrying like one of these horrible like medicine wear bags, you know, peddling my I'm Dr. O'Connor from town to town, you know, some sort of charlatan doctor, Dr. Whiskey.
Instead of saying, I have 10 different recipes for pots.
Yeah, you know.
Not legal.
Cures all your ills, you know.
So building on this PhD, you're now going to write a new book.
Yes.
Is that all right that we do this?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So now we're going over to your Créatúr.
Yes.
Yeah. What's this?
So Créatúr is the kind of overflowing of the PhD into book number 2. So the best part of the day, and I thought the PhD panel would be more enjoyable than it was, but I actually spent the whole day as a nervous wreck, pacing up and down the hallway, making sure everything was right. And then afterwards, we all poured into a pub, and I remember talking to people who were on the panel, and they were saying, "Oh, you know, I really loved the taste of number 7. We'd be interested in doing that. I really loved number 9," and I had to tell him, "Well, we scrambled the mashes, so I have no idea what you were drinking." But but there was that curiosity, and certainly like I had done stuff with people before the PhD proper, but I really started kind of having these odd conversations with people afterwards. And so I found myself kind of doing projects with people in all kinds of these little rabbit holes beyond this. So I've done stuff with Ecklinville, with Shorecross, with loads of stuff with Cologne. These pet projects that people were very passionate about, like, you know, David Boyd Armstrong's from Belfast, and Belfast used to be full of column stills. And he has a little column still, and we did an old Belfast grain whiskey from the Conswater distillery. So, you know, it was something that was close to his heart, you know, or, you know, again, Ecklinville, I worked with them on some of this old Cumber mash bill that was in the public records office. So anyway, the book Créatúr is kind of everything that the thesis couldn't be. It's the kind of history of talking about this stuff in pubs with distillers, sitting in warehouses and having these chats, the living history that there's the past, but there's a kind of a moment in Irish whiskey now where we're at such a crossroads where we can abandon some of the paddywhackery and the twee and reach back to this organic gastronomic heritage of the liquid itself, and what can we pull from that, and what can we do, and how can we converse with the past, how can we change it, riff on it, not just like recreate it, but have a conversation with it and really build in that way. And Créatúr is obviously a nickname for whiskey in Ireland, the drop of the Créatúr, but I wanted that for the title because it's originally from creature, and I wanted this to be a history of Irish whiskey as a creature, as a created thing, almost as made by real people out of raw materials, and also a kind of ghost in the machine, the creature, the thing made, you know. And they're all topics about bits of history or bits of chemistry or all these conversations that have accrued over the years where I've been talking to distillers. And like, you know, I used to talk to Eric Ryan about raw barley, and you know, people talk about single pot still being very oily, and single pot still, we all know that raw barley is oily because we experienced, but I'd never actually seen a real strong argument as to why. And Eric, this is a real topic of his, and he was saying, well, you know, there's a much higher lipid content in barley before the malting process. So like those kinds of conversations, we're thinking, holy shit, I'd love to talk more about that and involve some GCMS and, you know, these kinds of streams of thought. So each chapter is based on some sort of a project, and each chapter has a throwaway. So like, I don't know if you've had this yet.
Okay. No, not this one.
So this is
so let's show this so they can see, talk about it. What is this?
On Buchel Quail Dove. So that was done for Créatúr by Cologne. And on Buchel Quail Dove, the dark slender boy, which is an old euphemism for poaching, the bottle literally, they you know. And it's also in a lot of the names of tunes, and one very famous tune as a kind of a term for the, you know, and there's anyway, so that poaching comes from a chapter to do with poaching in the Irish song tradition. And there's a figure in the 20th century, Sean O'Riordan, who would have been, along with Seamus Ennis, probably the most important person in the revival of Irish trad, a towering figure. He was a composer, he recovered a lot of tunes, he became kind of the face of Irish music for a long time, even in, like, you know, if you ever saw Barry Lyndon, the Stanley Kubrick film, there's a lot of Irish music in the back, and that's all Sean O'Riordan, you know, and all his belongings are now in University College Cork, or a bunch of them are. They have a whole archive called the Sean O'Riordan Archive, and he is very much this kind of patron saint of, he died in the beginning of the 70s, but a mate of mine is a lecturer down there, Padraig, and he wrote his PhD on Sean O'Riordan, and he called me one day, he said, you know, Fionnán, I found a recipe for poaching in Sean O'Riordan's belongings. Is this any use to you? Yes. So we brought Paddy up to Cologne. I'll show you the recipe itself. So there it is.
Oh, exactly. Okay.
It was literally on the back of a grocery sheet, and it's sugar, molasses, grated apples, boiled potatoes, real kind of out of the cupboard stuff. But still, like, this is what would have been passed around a kitchen in West Cork in these legendary sessions. And Paddy, you know, was telling me about these sessions. You know, you look at the descriptions of these kitchen sessions. You had a young Seamus Heaney around. You had John Montague. You had all these cultural figures that remember it. And this idea of, you know, this poaching would have been associated specifically with a man named Larry Dillon, who's a kind of a part of that scene. and was known as a kind of poaching maker. So there's a whole backstory behind it, you know. But to have found that in that particular archive of all places, you know. So all the parts of the book are based on these kinds of projects, and we're funding the book through a kind of a crowdsourcing thing. So to keep it as independent as possible and allow me to write, you know, I had a meeting with a publisher early days, quite a big publisher, and they said to me, oh, well, this seems a bit niche. Yeah. What we'd like is if you wrote a book, Introduction to Irish Whiskey. And I thought, oh, fuck this.
No.
And so then I thought, right, there has to be some way to write the book I want to write, because I don't want to write the wrong book, you know, and a big publisher is not the way to do that, you know. And so the crowdfunding was basically to enable that to happen. Yeah. And so what we've done, I personally own a cask of the Bourbon thesis stuff. At the end of the project, they basically told me, look, we'd like to give you a cask. Right. Pick one. So mine is a certain mash bill. It's from the old Locks archive. 1950s mash bill, 40% malt, 40% raw barley, 15% oats, and 5% rye in Oloroso sherry. Okay. And we're using the cask share as a way to fund the book. So I don't need a cask of whiskey, but I do need a book. Yeah. It's about 3.5 years old now. We're bottling it as a 7-year-old. Yeah. The idea there being a kind of a wink back at Not a Drop Sold till it's 7 years old. Mm-hmm. You know, old Bow Street Pasta was a 7-year-old, Old Powers was a 7-year-old, Old Cumber was a 7-year-old. Young enough to kind of keep the mash bill a little active, but give it some time in sherry. So if people join the crowdfunding, they get a share of that. Yeah. They get a book, obviously, at the end with their name in the back as a benefactor. And then for the 2 years in between, we have what we call the hedge school. Hedge school is another term for illegal Irish schools back in the dark old days. Yeah. But, you know, the idea of the run education, and they're all online talks and live social events talking about very specific aspects of Irish distilling culture and history. So like we had Paddy on to talk about music to the group, or in 2 weeks, Mike Billett of Peatland Restoration Science, who has his own fantastic whiskey book, The Unbreakable Bond. He's coming to Ireland, and I'm taking him up to Donegal to visit Waylock and Slieve League, and we'll have him talk to the group, and it became a way of kind of sharing the journey with people, and then any liquids that are produced along the way become crowdfunder exclusive. So, for instance, this one was only sold to crowdfunders. So those who bought it got a bottle in the mail yesterday. We held some for Whiskey Live, so there's about 50 left. So if people sign up now, they can. If you sign up during this, you know, we can't do this all night, Jason. But anyway, the website is creator.ie or creature.ie, or again, there's the QR codes there. And so this is just one example, you know, but there's more coming in that space. We're rowing, you know, there's another one we're doing with Killowen quite soon. We're rowing whiskey out to Isla relatively soon, based on another old song called My Sorrow Is On You, Blonde Boy. Actually, again, another euphemism for whiskey. But it's about rowing illicit whiskey from the north coast of Ireland into the Hebrides. And it's actually a Scottish Gaelic song, it's not Irish. But you get this idea of when whiskey, before there was Scotch and Irish hard concepts, when it was just something made by farmers, a folk material, traded, you know, and so we're rowing it over, putting the Killowen in an ex-peated Bunnahabhain cask, and then rowing it back, and then it ceases to be Irish whiskey because it's left Ireland, and that's the whole point. They're kind of testing that water, and then we'll let it age in the peated cask. It's currently sitting in an Irish virgin oak cask, so we give them the Irish cask as a gift back, and there's a kind of we have a bit of a session on both ends. That liquid will be a kind of a members thing. So anything that happens during we have to find something to do with the liquid anyway. So it's a great way of kind of sharing the space. So again, we've sold about half of them. It'll be the next 2 years. It's just started, really.
What does it cost?
€250. Right. So, and it's a one-time off, you know. So after that, and I'll be honest, like out of that 250, 40 is not even fundraising. That's just a book pre-sale. And then we send books, and that gives us soft power with publishers, where we could say we have these pre-sales. 10 is a stride processing fee, and then the 200 is the cask fundraiser. Now, I want to be very clear. Two Stacks have really rowed in and made this happen. I can't do this stuff myself. and it's tricky enough to sell alcohol in the first place.
Yeah.
So Two Stacks really were instrumental in setting up.
Brendan.
Yes, Shane, Liam, who
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Liam, who especially has been setting up some of the financial stuff behind it. Shane's been a titan. They've all been great. But it was to set a kind of a framework where we could invoice that and blah blah blah, and keep it as a kind of cohesive program. So when people buy into that, all online talks are free. Any warehouse tastings, we're literally just ticketing at cost. Like if we have to get a boss, it's a tenner each way. They're cheap as chips. And then the bottle obviously comes with it. So it's that three-pronged, the cash share itself, the book obviously with a thank you to you, and then this kind of journey of sharing all these liquids as they happen. And then ancillary to that, the opportunity to, I don't make any money off of things like this, but members get exclusive access to them from the distilleries, and I've asked the distilleries not to sell them to the public but to sell them to us. So it's a way of thanking people for. So it's a long road ahead. I mean, there's 24 chapters. It traces literally from the Middle Ages to the 1990s. And pet topics, tracing a kind of a grassroots history of Irish distilling, and really, bringing it back from that kind of brand segregation into kind of a grassroots idea of the creator as a liquid shared, that this kind of belongs to everyone. And that was why it was important for me to keep the book independent and to kind of be able to choose who I want to work with and what we want to do. And it's not a distillery tour of Ireland. It's not, it's literally pet projects with specific people, and it's kind of half about the past and half about the people at it now. It's as much about Brendan Carty of Clowen as it is about like Samuel Morwood in 1830, and this kind of present stuff that interests me about contemporary Irish distilling, haunted by stuff that interests me about historic Irish distilling.
Like haunts you.
Yeah.
That's very good.
So that's
it. Wow. I'm really, really glad to talk to you here about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
WhiskyJason here together with
Fionnán O'Connor.
And where can we become a member of your crowdsourcing program one last time?
Creator.ie, or if you're saying creature.ie, it'll redirect you, because creator is a funny word to spell.
Yes.
Or the QR code will bring you there.
Bye-bye.
And we appreciate all the support, It's we really are looking forward to it. Even if there wasn't money involved, I'd be delighted to fucking just talk leather to people for 2 years,